Welcome to EC Talk. We're so glad that you're joining us today. And let me tell you, if you've ever walked through a loss that reshaped your whole world, this book called Michael's Eyes is a story that's going to make you feel seen in a way maybe you haven't for a long time. Welcome, author Robert W. Foster. Robert, thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited. And Robert, before we started recording this interview, you were talking about how it was one little seed in the Bible that inspired this book. Would you speak to that?
Sure. The little scene is in the ninth chapter of the Gospel of John, and it's about a man born blind, went through his life as a beggar, sitting by the road with a little tin cup, and he gets to be an adult apparently, although the Gospel doesn't give us much information about this man except that he was blind and made his living as a beggar. Suddenly in the story, along comes somebody who did something, not sure what, but he's with some other men and they're walking along the street or the road. And my friend Michael, I gave this man names just for the possibility of telling the story about him. Michael hears these people, and somebody says something about who is it with this man? Why is he blind? Something that he did, or was it his parents? And they go into a discussion about that. And the next thing that Michael knows, he's just sitting there, like, listening. Next thing he knows, one of the other men has picked something up off the ground, wiped it on his eyes, and Michael gets up and wanders off, and he goes back into the village or the city. And that's how that happened. Well, the sermon, of course, goes on to the purpose. What was the purpose of this man's eyesight being taken away? I was less interested in that than I was in the man Michael and what happened to him in his life after this miracle. After all, he had no education. He couldn't read, couldn't write, had no trade, had no way to make a living except with a tin cup. And now that he could see, he couldn't even do that anymore. And so I was kind of challenged as a sort of a intellectual exercise to try to figure it out. I assumed that a loving God would not have used this man and then gone off and left him to make his own way. So what could it have been? And I started writing about it, just different ideas, maybe this, maybe that. And somebody looking over my shoulder saw what I was doing and said, that's an interesting story. It's a challenge too. Why don't you do some more writing? He says, You could even develop that into a book." Well, I hadn't written any books, but I did that. And over the next few months, I developed a story that I eventually published. And it was very interesting and I enjoyed it. Get a, okay, that takes care of that. I enjoyed the challenge, intellectual challenge, and I found a way for Michael to make a living and actually have a full life. But
Wow.
it was fun. It was challenging.
What was the career or means for him making money that you landed on?
Well, what we know about blind people, and I've known a few in my life. We had a guest from Great Britain who was blind and stayed with us for a while. What I've discovered a lot about people who were blind or had been blind for a long time was they have developed this terrific memory. They had to memorize, and Michael talks about that in the book, how he found his way through the village where everybody else was going fast, running fast, but he had to stumble along. And of course, he didn't understand blindness. He had no concept of what blindness meant because he had no concept of sight and light. And so he had to memorize his way. So he knew every little chuck hole in the street from his house to the place where he begged by the road. And he became very much in a very strong memory. And that's not unusual, at least in my experience. And so as soon as he got his sight, he began thinking, oh, how, his father was kind of bitter about the whole thing. His father said his mother was, she was amazed. She said, "This is wonderful. The Lord has done this wonderful miracle," and so on and so forth. And his father said, "Miracle, miracle. This is nothing but a problem for me. I'm going to have to feed this boy. He can't earn a penny or cent. He's going to have to be a beggar." And that's how Michael started out being a beggar. But ultimately, with his memory and the miracle of his sight and his own very strong character, and he had very strong character, he said, "I can be a teacher. I've got to learn all about the Hebrew language, and I've got to learn some philosophy and mathematics. I've got to learn all those things, but I'll catch up, and I'll be a teacher of young boys." And in the Jewish faith, of course, young boys start very, very early in their education. And that's where Michael made his way. And ultimately, he became a very successful uh, lecturer and teacher of young boys. And the story goes on from there.
Robert, my goodness, there's so much to talk about here. The first thing that comes to mind is I am a big believer in miracles, and I think a lot of people who are listening and watching are open to
Right.
the idea of God doing miracles. And the question that follows after something wonderful happens, what now? Something's been
Exactly.
changed. I prayed to get pregnant. I prayed for this relationship to work. I prayed to get healthier. I prayed for a job. All of those could be miracles that you go, now what? So it's very relatable. It's so much more than just Michael and his sight. We can really apply this to all of our lives.
Right. And especially in this case, Michael found a possibility to have a wife. And he had assumed that could never be for a blind man to have a wife. But his parents made connection through a marriage broker with another family who had a daughter who had her own disability. Her legs were withered and she could barely walk, and she was handicapped all of her life. And her parents knew about Michael, and they decided these two very unfortunate young people, they could lean on each other and make a life, however it might be. And it was more fun writing about that part of it, how Michael and his soon-to-be wife Leah, how they met. And in Leah's case, this was absolutely out of the question. She wanted nothing to do with marriage. She knew that she was homely. She knew that she was handicapped. There was no point. She could never be anybody's wife. And she resisted. She had a wonderful discussion with her father over this because her father wanted to make this marriage because her father and mother were going to be old, and when they were gone, what becomes of Leah? And they just thought it would be wonderful that she could be married. So they went along with the marriage counselor, and, and said, "All right, make the connection," and they did. And of course, Michael was quite eager about the whole thing. That was a wonderful idea, but Leah was absolutely opposed to it. She said, "This is disgusting." She said, "I don't want any part of it." What do you mean? She was told that this young man was handicapped. She said, "Handicapped? What? Is he a cripple too? What?
Oh,
Or maybe he doesn't have arms, and he'll provide the legs, and I'll be the arms. Will be one person. Is that
she
the way
was
to
looking at her
maybe?"
weakness and thinking that her weakness was being reflected onto his, that that would be what his weakness is. Robert, what really comes so much coming to mind, but I think about how when we have to go through hard times, it builds our character. It makes us, I'm thinking that Leah and Michael went into this marriage years beyond their age because of the character that was built through the struggles they had to go through. Would you speak to that?
Absolutely. In their case, of course, it starts out very unevenly with Michael being excited about the idea and Leah being repulsed by it. But when she met Michael, she pitied him because of his handicap, and she got to know him a little bit, and pretty soon they became very attached to each other, and eventually they developed what turned out to be love. And of course, in the book, I continue into their life and how all of that developed. But
Yeah.
the point here was that she had this very negative approach to the whole thing, and he was so positive.
Yeah.
But his positivity and his energy and his youth, and of course he was a strong young man. He just couldn't see. That was the only problem.
Right.
So it worked for her, and for him it was no problem.
Yeah.
He all of his life he had when he was a teenager he asked his father when could he have a wife, and his father said, "There's no way you can have a wife. No, no, you can't have a wife." And tried to explain to him what it meant to be blind. And of course, my that's another very side issue. Michael explaining to his father what it meant to be blind. And he said, "You have no idea.
Right.
You've never experienced light.
You don't.
Therefore, you have no appreciation of what is blind." And so when his father said there was no hope for you to be ever married, Michael didn't quite understand that. So later on, when this young woman comes along into their life, it changes everything. And for Michael, it's the second miracle in his life.
Wow, Robert, that's amazing. What is the
Well,
big, what, I was just going to ask you, what is the bigger message? What is the main message that you want people to take away from this?
why do some believe and some do not? And through the book, uh, Michael goes on a, they get married, they have a, wonderful approach to each other. And Michael didn't quite understand what was going on, but strange things happened after they were married.
Mm.
Well, actually, before they were even married, Jesus was crucified. And of course, Michael didn't know about that. He heard about it, and, it was a matter of gossip. But then he went on for the rest of his life saying, "How could this be? How can this be?
Mm,
This miracle of my sight, number one, the miracle of eventually his marriage." He says, "How can it be?" And so he goes on the rest of his life looking for people who had similar experiences with his rabbi, whoever
mm,
he was. See, Michael never really finds out about Jesus. Okay, that he had two encounters with Jesus, but he didn't know much about him. So he goes on through his whole life finding people who had been touched by Jesus, and sometimes they believed and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were bitter. There were 10 lepers that he cleaned. And at least in the book, I depart a little bit from that whole leper thing. But in the book, the lepers were cured, but there were other lepers still on the dump site of the city doing the picking through the garbage. That's the only thing they could do. And they were left behind, and they were bitter. Some of their brothers had been given their clean condition, but these that were left behind were bitter. And that struck me that how can you witness something like that happening, that these middle-aged or old men, beggars or lepers, suddenly become clean.
yeah,
Anyway, that's typical of some of the things that I try to take real characters out of the Gospels and build a little bit of something around them.
yeah.
Uh, the woman that Jesus saved from stoning became one of my favorite characters. I won't try to go through that, but
Well,
how
it brings up the question, just going back to what you were saying about watching miracles happen, but it didn't happen to them. How do we handle things when God answers prayers for some and doesn't for another? How do we handle that? Is that a question of the strength of our faith? Um, why? So many whys.
my experience hasn't proposed that particular thing. People I have discovered either they believe in miracles or they don't.
Mm.
And I've never talked to anybody who saw a miracle and then said, "How come not me?"
Right.
Although one of the characters in my book said, "I believe in miracles when one happens to me."
Mm. Hmm.
That's true.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a possibility, and that's what in my comments at the end of the book, I talk a little bit about that.
Hmm.
Why do some believe and some do not?
Hmm.
And I would hope that if anybody comes out of a book with a challenge, that would be the challenge that they confront.
Mm. Well, let's move in and I want to ask you, does modern understanding of the world's realities contradict scripture today?
That's a question. That's a good question. Um, I One of the things that has impressed me in preparing to talk to you was how this whole exercise has affected me. And as I went through this, looking at all of this, at one point, Michael, who has become a teacher of young boys, is challenged by some of his students. And they say, this crazy business of the Genesis and how the world became, some people actually believe that. And Michael had to deal with that conflict. In the Hebrew culture, of course, what was in Genesis was real, absolutely real. There's no contradiction. And so I imagine that little boys, some of them saying, wait a minute, they couldn't have been like that. How could that be? But other little boys whose parents were standing there with a stick over them, this is what you believe, whether you
This
like it
is,
or not.
yes.
And I dealt with that by Michael saying, well, wait a minute, boys, wait a minute now. When Moses wrote what we read about the beginning of the world was a long time ago. People didn't have as much understanding then as we have today about science and so on and so forth. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking about the year 2025 when people poo-poo the whole business of Genesis, but they overlooked the fact that when that was written, Moses had no understanding of chemistry. He had no understanding of physics, geology, any of that, archaeology. He was trying to describe the beginning of life and the world in terms that he and his readers could understand. So consequently, what we're reading seems childish to us now. But let's be real. Let's give him a break. After all, he didn't have what we have to
Right,
explain the beginning of the world.
right. Wow.
And that's how Michael dealt with it with the little boys. He said, you've got to just remember the context here. And that I worked out myself and in my own mind as I got to that part of the story. And I said, what do I really believe about that? Well, I'm an engineer. So as I say, cause and effect. Um, Everything has to be logical. Well, the first logical thing to understand is that writing is ancient without any basis, without even the terminology that we use today to talk about the creation of life and the world. And that's something else I would hope people might take away from this is to think about that a little bit. Not only did Moses talk about all of these things long, long before there was any understanding of the science, since then, we've had 2,000 years of commentary by very brilliant people about the New Testament and argument and discussion and commentary. That's why we are so superior in our knowledge today to say that, oh, that's all childish talk, all that business. Wait a minute.
Yeah,
It's childish talk to us, but to them, it meant
yeah.
something very real. And as a matter of fact, most of what we know today about creation does not contradict Moses' description.
Mm.
But Moses spoke in in terms and metaphor that made it possible for him to talk about something he didn't really know very much about, but he's not contradicted.
Mm.
The creation was in 7 days according to Moses, but we know that's not true. But that 7 day characteristic puts a time element on the
Mm.
creation. Now we can understand a little better.
Helps us,
We're
yeah, have concept. We have the advantage of hindsight is everything.
absolutely,
My goodness.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. And St. Paul, of course, he the New Testament is full of his explanations to the people,
Mhm.
and we rely upon what we read in St. Paul's letters. So, we shouldn't be superior when we think
No.
of our intellectual advancement over those
Mhm.
people.
We should just consider ourselves fortunate that we have that hindsight, that 2020 vision. Robert,
Yeah.
how did this book change you in writing it?
Well, that's interesting. I had always had a certain admiration for the literary world. As an engineer, I don't know if you know many engineers, but most of us are not very imaginative. And so I had a real respect for the literary life. And when I got into, especially into the whole self-publishing business, beyond the writing, the actual publishing, discovered that the publishing and printing business is a zoo, an absolute zoo. And trying to get anywhere, there are so many people who are uh, scavenging and
It's very
destroying.
saturated. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's one thing I learned.
Hmm.
But the other thing I learned, going back to that whole business of let's put it into context. What do we believe today, and based on what? And we have the scriptures. To what extent can we count on those scriptures? And as I've gone back and read more of that, of the scriptures critically, I've discovered that, wait a minute, there's not much contradiction here. After all, people love to talk about the contradictions in scripture, but there is not nearly as much as people think if they really think of context and what it is we're dealing with intellectually. So
Very.
that gave me. I never used to make those arguments before I wrote the book, so I guess
Mhm.
the book has changed me.
It has. That's in a beautiful way. We just keep growing. Every experience helps us to grow and change and mold more. We have to start kind of bringing this interview down for a landing, but what would you like the the big impression to be, the big takeaway?
I think just what we've been talking about. If you have any interest in scripture, put it in context and overlay what we know today about, say, for instance, creation, overlay that with the Moses description, I assume that Moses is the writer of Genesis. A lot of people say no, it was somebody else, or maybe a lot of different people. But overlay what we know today in our intellectual advancement against what was written at that time, where there was so little understanding of the factual parts of the world. That's what I would like to see people think more of.
Mm,
Then, after thinking about that for a while, why do you believe and why do you not believe?
mhm.
Well, okay, we can't you can't condemn people for not believing,
Right,
but you can say consider this and this and this and that.
right.
Uh, I I mentioned the woman who was saved from stoning, and at one point she and Leah developed a friendship, and it was one way to get her into the story so that she could tell her story too. And she had this view of life and men in particular, men. Of course, she was almost stoned to death, but she was saved by somebody, some rabbi. Didn't even know who it was, but she was saved, and she became very bitter, looking back on her years as a prostitute, because she had several years as a prostitute, and her whole idea of men and the possibility. She was stunned to learn that Leah and Michael had this wonderful marriage. She had never come across that kind of dependence and love for two people. She didn't know it was even possible for a man and a wife to have that kind of a marriage. And there's some talk about that. Uh, but then she tells Leah her own philosophy, and it gets to some rather intimate discussion of that sort of thing. I won't go into that here now, but it was fun writing about it and
Yes.
fun thinking about it too.
Well, she had her own what now experience. Now she
Mm.
can't go back to doing, she's been cleansed, she's been forgiven, her eyes have been opened. She can't go back to doing prostitution. Now what? And I think that's
Now,
just so relatable with not the prostitution part, but the miracles that happen and the changes that God makes in our life. And we go, now what? I'm a different person. I'm a new creation. Now what?
exactly. Yeah. And she and Leah became so close. And she was such an admirer of Leah. And of course, Leah had nothing in her experience to even suggest what prostitution was. And so she was blown away when this woman told her a little bit about her background.
Mm.
And the two, it was kind of like when Leah and Michael were getting to where they can actually communicate with each other and understand each other. It was the same in this experience that
That
Leah
same
had with the
dynamic between the
ex
two women.
prostitute. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that was kind of interesting to deal with. But
Yeah.
the woman's whole idea was, it's not our fault. It's not our fault. It's men. It's men in their lust.
Mm.
Why do you suppose we have to wear a hat on the top of our heads? And God forbid that I should go out with bare arms. Oh, the
Oh,
world would explode. Why is that? It's because of men and their own ability to control themselves. That's why we have to be this way. You don't hear that. You don't
yeah.
hear that very much these days.
No, I see another book in that whole concept. Robert,
Yeah,
do you have a book? Do you have your book handy that you could just hold up?
sure.
Okay.
It just so happens.
I love that. I'm going to have you hold it up just a little bit higher for those that are watching the video. Beautiful. And this can be purchased at robertwfoster.com. And Robert,
Yeah,
thank you.
sure.
Yeah. What were you going to
Yeah,
say?
it's uh, it's been fun doing it, and I always love talking about it.
Yeah.
We had a thing at our local library, and they asked me to introduce the book, and I read some of the parts, and there are 4 or 5 parts in the book that I really enjoy reading and reviewing. I approve of my own book.
Yeah.
Is,
Very good. Well, that's good.
is that arrogance or what?
No. It's confidence
Yeah,
and it's encouragement to have other people purchase the book, give it a rating,
yeah,
and share your
yeah.
thoughts. Robert, thank you so much for joining us again. Have a great day. I look forward to maybe a second follow-up book to talk to you about.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Suzanne. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.